This video was Patreon exclusive for 30 days before it made it onto TIL Vids, YouTube, and LBRY. So, if you like this video, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, and you can see videos like this 30 days early. Let's get to the video now. Hey guys, what's up? PizzaLovingNerd here. Firefox is my favorite browser. So, what if you took Chrome OS and just yeeted out Chrome and, put Firefox on it? Well, that exists, but it's not an operating system for desktops or laptops. It's actually an operating system for phones. So in this video, I'm going to go over the history of Firefox OS, what I like about it and what I don't, and what ended up leading to its demise. Let's get into it. On July 25th, 2011, the Boot to Gecko project was announced on the Mozilla Dev Platform mailing list. The goal of this project was to let web developers build web apps that were just as good as native apps. This was supposed to be possible using a set of APIs that allowed websites to access phone things like the camera, SMS, Bluetooth, you name it. Every part of the UI was built with HTML5 and JavaScript, which could have taken off with OEMs because OEMs are being forced to put heavy skins over Android that slow down and bloat the system and make updates harder to push out, whereas Firefox, you just change the code just like you change a website with Inspect Element. And since everything is built with web technologies, I found a screenshot of an early build of the UI for Firefox OS running inside of a Firefox window, which is pretty impressive. Like, imagine being able to run GNOME inside a Firefox window without a Linux kernel or anything. Although GNOME is not written in HTML5, so I guess that's not that impressive, but still. The OS itself was built on Linux with a hardware abstraction layer from Android to get more phones working. Almost a year later, in March of 2012, Mozilla showed off a demo of Boot to Gecko at Mobile World Congress running on a Samsung Galaxy S2. What's interesting about this build from Mobile World Congress is that the UI is drastically different from what we ended up seeing later from Firefox OS. I mean, it was probably easy to change since, again, it's just HTML, but still interesting. Anyways, later in July of 2012, we had a rebranding of Boot to Gecko to a new name, which is called Firefox OS. I know, how predictable. We also got some screenshots of Firefox OS later, and it kind of looked like a bad fusion of pre-Lollipop Android with an iOS 6 home screen. Later in November of 2012, Mozilla launched a simulator for Firefox OS that allowed developers to test their apps on their computer. Although as a GDK developer, it's nicer to be able to test my apps on a desktop or a PC, laptop, whatever, without an emulator or a simulator. In February 2013, Mozilla showed off another demo of Firefox OS at Mobile World Congress, and they also announced that they're partnering with several phone manufacturers including LG, ZTE, TCL, and Huawei. Although TCL and Huawei actually never made any Firefox OS phones, so I guess those partnerships fell through. But eventually, Mozilla did get the ball rolling with their hardware partners, and actually quite a few phones started coming out with Firefox OS. And also, there are some phones that got ports of Firefox OS, such as the Nexus 5. But Mozilla wanted to go beyond phones and turn this into an OS for all things smart devices. So, in 2015, Mozilla partnered up with Panasonic, and all Panasonic TVs run Firefox OS now. Even to this day, Panasonic still runs a heavily modified version of Firefox OS on their TVs. But Mozilla wanted to make it run on every smart device. Whether it's a smartwatch, smart TV, smartphone, smart fridge, smart washing machine, I don't know, smart tissues. They wanted to get Firefox OS running on it. Unfortunately, that dream never really took off because in January of 2017, Mozilla announced that Firefox OS was going to be discontinued. Despite Firefox OS being killed, I decided to put it on my phone anyway. So, I'm running an ancient build. Well, I guess it's still the newest build, but still ancient. I'm running a build of Firefox OS on my Nexus 5, and I have quite a few good things to say about it. I love its UI, although its UI is not as good as Ubuntu Touch's gestures or Windows Mobile's Live Tile UI. However, I think it's the third best UI of pretty much any mobile operating system that I've tried. Mozilla managed to create a very slick and stylish UI that gets out of your way when you're using your phone. The animations are fluid, and it actually has one of the fastest browsing experiences I've ever used on a phone. Firefox OS's browser can run just as fast as most flagship Android phones I've tried, and I'm running this on a 7-year-old Nexus 5 from 2013. I also like how the app switcher also shows all of your browser's tabs, which means that all your web apps don't feel out of place. It's not like you're running Safari and all your other apps, and then to go back to a web app, you have to click on Safari and then go to your Safari tabs. Honestly, if this wasn't a discontinued OS, I would probably give this a spin and use this as a daily driver OS for a while. However, despite my praise for Firefox OS, there is a reason it failed. As good as Firefox OS was, it didn't really solve a problem. There weren't really any exclusive features for Firefox OS because all of the apps are web apps. You can run any Firefox OS app on your iPhone, Android phone, Windows phone, Linux phone, pretty much any device actually that can access the internet. The reason Chrome OS was somewhat successful is that most people use web apps on their computers, so having an OS that accesses the web makes a lot of sense for a cheap laptop. But do you really use your phone just to use the web browser when native versions of most browser apps will give you a much better experience? So not only are you being forced to use web apps, but also those web apps can be used on any device that has internet access anyway. This was an issue with the original iPhone actually. Steve Jobs did not want iPhone OS to have an app store. He wanted everything to be a website in Safari, and people would create shortcuts that take you to Safari's website. Eventually, Apple caved in to native apps with the iPhone and released the App Store with iPhone OS 2.0. To be fair though, Firefox OS does seem to implement web apps a lot better than iOS 1.0 did. Each web app shows up as an individual app inside of the app switcher, whereas web apps in the first version of iPhone OS just show up as shortcuts that opened up Safari tabs. The issue again is I could still access any of these web apps on any other phone platform. So Mozilla focused on making the OS buttery smooth on low-end hardware, and they decided to target lower-end phones. You would pick up a Firefox OS phone because it was cheap. Basically, Chrome OS, the reason you would want a Chromebook instead of a Windows Chromebook, mostly is because they're cheap. And Firefox OS was trying to do the same thing. You don't really want a Firefox OS phone, but it's cheap, so you might as well get one. If you think about it, a Firefox OS phone isn't that bad of a value. You pay less than $100 for your phone and you get hardware that isn't great, but the software on it is buttery smooth. Plus, it can run your favorite web apps like YouTube, Twitter, whatever. Other than being cheap though, there aren't really any special features in Firefox OS, so if you just want to use PWAs, there's not really a reason to use Firefox OS over iOS, Android, or even Windows Phone or any other alternative mobile platform. So without being able to support native apps and no real big features other than cheapness, there wasn't really that big of a reason for most people to use Firefox OS, and that is why it failed. However, the legacy of Firefox OS still lives on in several ways. As I said earlier, Panasonic TVs still use a heavily modified version of Firefox OS on their TVs to this day, and Firefox OS got forked into KaiOS, which is an OS designed exclusively for cheap feature phones. iOS has actually been doing very well in less developed countries like India and African countries, and it even has backing from Google, with Google actually putting both Google Assistant, YouTube, and other Google services on KaiOS. There was also a fork of Firefox OS from a company called Acadine, called H5OS, and this company even had Mozilla executives in it. But unfortunately, this OS never took off and was never publicly released. There is also BTG OS, which was a continuation of Firefox OS, but it pretty much got abandoned after like 6 months, which is a shame because I love B2G OS on my Pine phone. We have also seen a very similar project from Google recently called Android Go, which is a stripped-down version of Android designed for very cheap phones just like Firefox OS that uses something called Light apps, which are basically dedicated web apps. But Android Go also has the advantage that it can run Play Store apps even if it can't run them well. So what can we learn from the failure of Firefox OS, and how could this help the mobile Linux community? For one, your platform has to have native apps. If your platform is literally only web apps, then why not use a more established platform like iOS that lets you use web apps with your native apps? You also have to make a compelling reason for people to use your platform. Sure, Firefox OS did work on cheap phones, and Firefox OS didn't have any of Google or Apple's data collection. But other than that, there's no reason to use Firefox OS when you could get almost the same thing just by downloading Firefox from the Google Play Store. Anyways, that's the video. Thanks to my $5 and $10 sauce and cheese tier patrons, Jim Peter, Jonathan Reynolds, Sam Covett, and Mitchell Vantino. Again, this video was Patreon exclusive for 30 days, so you want more videos like this early, check out my Patreon.